You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskens, your host as always. This week we've got one of the smartest men in property back in the studio. It's Sean Morrison from the APP Group. You would have heard of him, I reckon, a year ago, having a chat about just fundamentals of our market, really understanding the drivers from a government public side, especially into what's happening in West Australia's property space and specifically as well the City of Perth's property space. And I wanted to get Sean in after watching him provide an update to a private audience a couple of weeks ago and to share that with the broader audience on the Perth Property Show, the thousands of people that listen every single week, and understand where we are at in our journey, our evolution, our maturity as a property market, and what are those factors, those levers that should be being pulled if they're not being pulled, and what are the exciting things that are happening as well. Sean, thanks so much for coming back in, mate.
Good to be back, Trent.
We've got 2,940 properties on the market. We transacted on a third of those last week, and we're building about 60% of the houses I reckon we need to be building right now. Are we in market failure?
Short answer is yes. And I think that's a reasonable thing to say. And having just sold a unit that I owned and helped a family member sell a house all in the last couple of weeks, yeah, properties are moving fast and prices are definitely reaching territories not previously reached.
That's an outcome of market failure though, isn't it?
Yes, to a certain degree. We're effectively dealing with the consequences of a fairly medium-term supply sluggish period where there's just simply not enough houses available on the market or new houses being brought to the market. And you can see some corrections happening to that market failure or responses to that via a lot more direct investment in housing via the state and federal governments, which I think is an appropriate response. However, I would say is that most levels of government effectively exited that space for several decades and are now coming in to the market when construction costs are extremely high, where you don't get necessarily buck. So the cost of each extra marginal dwelling is significant. What would have helped this crisis, apart from many other things that the private market could have done in conjunction with government, would have been a bit more of a steady stream of government investment into housing.
Pre-COVID.
Just as an ongoing normal business of government.
Yeah, maybe there needs to be some sort of legislation going forward that mandates a minimum number of houses being built for social and affordable housing by the government, regardless of business case financially going forward, which I think you're right has a benefit to the steady supply of housing, whether we need it or not in that year, because at some point in time we do, but also the steady supply of work for tradies and apprentices to ensure we aren't losing the arse out of that industry with the ever-present opportunities up north in the mines.
Absolutely, and I think we all forget as a city and a state that things were actually pretty rough before COVID for a good 5 to 7 year period, and that would have been a brilliant time for a lot more sustained investment into housing. There's all sorts of reasons and financial pressures why that didn't occur. That was pre-GST fix, so deficits were getting quite significant. So to a degree, it's understandable, but in hindsight, probably regrettable.
Regrettable, and what we're getting now is half the amount of houses being built for the same amount of money, or spending double to get the houses that we need. And we are certainly paying for it right now as a community in the same way we're paying for our ham and cheese toastie at a local coffee shop. It's all outcomes that are less desirable for the long term than they would have been if we just pulled the trigger pre-COVID.
You're right, and to your point about business cases and stacking up, by definition, affordable and social housing will never stack up.
No, that's the
point. It
point.
will always be subsidised, just like a road or a primary school. There's no direct revenue feedback, apart from a little bit of moderate rent perhaps. You can spin and complicate things as much as you like, but certain things just require government investment where the market simply won't deliver it because there's no profit to be made.
John Kerry's trying as hard as he can now, but obviously we're a few years in and still struggling to see huge inroads from a government perspective. We've just seen 67,000 people year to March come through on the ABS statistics, which means we needed about 30-ish thousand houses built. We built 20. And that's where that 60-something% ratio I mentioned at the start of this episode came in. I don't see a pathway, neither does the HIA, to getting to the 30-plus thousand. So it probably has to be immigration continually dropping down to 40 or less thousand a year for us to finally be in a balanced year where the outcome isn't prices rising limited only by affordability in certain suburbs. Therefore, what we need is leaders in this space on both a public and private sector, the public facilitating private opportunity on a risk for reward basis, to start to continue to make inroads at the higher density side of things as well. Because I think that's what we're missing. The land development space is really capping out in the 15 to 18,000 houses per year. And where we see 20,000 houses being built, that gap is infill, right? So infill really needs to be an extra 10,000 at least properties a year. Is there a pathway, especially within the City of Perth, where you focus a lot of your thought processes in your policy as well, is there a pathway to being able to actually deliver 10,000 apartments a year in Perth if you factor in builders, zoning, availability of land? If the numbers just stacked up tomorrow, do you see a path where the public sector can lead the way in that space? Is that what the City of Perth is trying to do in the contemporary times?
Sure. At a broader metropolitan level, I think the best thing that governments and policymakers can do is to minimise the potential restrictions and delays on supply.
And what are those restrictions?
Approval isn't necessarily a binary thing. So just if it's up or down, that simple metric doesn't really take into account the process and the time, the changes, the modifications, the risk, the uncertainty that may have occurred throughout that process. And we also need to take into account that approvals are like a lag indicator to a certain degree of what's possible. So you think about the frameworks that are in place across the whole city. Only some things will ever reach DA stage or even be contemplated as a project because, of course, market players will determine what's possible or reasonably possible on a site if they push things a little bit on a piece of land. The more liberal your framework, the more opportunities and the weird combination of factors that need to all coalesce at the same time for a development to get off the ground, the more you open up the possibilities for that across a broader spatial area, the greater chance that those things will get off the ground. And that applies when there's a housing crisis and also when there's not a housing crisis, because we're partly in a housing crisis because we didn't think that housing would be in crisis maybe 5 to 10 years ago. And I think it's incumbent on all players, particularly those people which have a role in deciding what framework should apply and the course of particular projects, that it should always be viewed partly with a lens of what will this mean for housing supply. And I think just in the last week or so, we've seen the New South Wales government introduce that as like a legislative criteria to take into account when determining projects, which I think is very positive.
Do you think we should be putting that into our decisioning framework in Western Australia as well, balancing that off against the things that have been arbitrary over the last few years, such as the environment, such as neighbour comments, overshadowing, overlooking, heritage impacts? I feel like those are the key factors that an approval is counterbalanced against at the moment, rather than, you're right, what is actually a basic need for society, which is, are we actually able to provide enough houses in the first place at the moment?
Yeah, I think there's merit in that. There's a laundry list of things which decision makers need to take into account when determining under the Act here in Western Australia. How much immediate difference that will make, I think that's debatable, but I don't think it would have any negative consequences.
Well, culture, doesn't it? Because there's a culture of gatekeeping and scrutineering in public planning circles rather than facilitation. So if you start to build in more optimistic, glass half full thought processes and foreshadowings into opening up an application and saying, hey, let's see how we can get this approved, rather than let's see why I wouldn't approve this. That's a very different way of putting a lens on an application that a developer has put probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars towards in the first place, because they believe there's value in trying to make a difference in this particular application.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I'd also add that there's high degrees of variance in terms of attitudes across the state, and certain parties with the right approach to housing and urban development, using the exact same system, the exact same laws essentially, find a way of being a lot more accommodating.
So it's a cultural thing.
Correct, yeah, and whether you add an extra provision or so on the Act also, like I said, is debatable, and it's hard to codify culture.
It's also hard to
but-
codify a lot of other things as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm not
Discretionary.
saying that it would be wasteful. It's potentially a good start, but there's probably a broader conversation to be had in terms of how you might want to change that whole cultural attitude. And back to your question about the City of Perth, I think most industry players would say that the City of Perth is very accommodating and very cognizant of its role as a capital city to be attractive to investment, particularly residential development. And that's definitely reflected in their cultural attitude to development and planning, and also their cultural attitude and response to process and accommodating, inviting developers and dealing with the circumstances as they are, as opposed to getting caught up in the pursuit of perfection, which I think is what a lot of people in planning world tend to do. And I was at the Planning Institute of Australia State Conference a few weeks ago, and Minister Kerry made one of the opening speeches or remarks, and he made a very salient, valid point, which I agree with completely, and which was the most perfect statement to make to a room of several hundred planners, which was, you can have the most perfect framework, the most perfect design guidelines and maps and pretty diagrams of how you want apartment blocks to look like or houses to look like, but if they don't manifest in the real world, it doesn't mean anything. It's just paper. That's all this is, bricks and mortar and concrete and roofs over people's heads. So excellent point by the Minister, and that's a good cultural umbrella through which to practice.
The frameworks around Western Australia. Who are the leaders? You've just mentioned the City of Perth culturally in terms of being pro-development or pro-progress, facilitation of aspiration. Are there other good examples that other local governments could be looking up to, or that progressive and aspirational local government planners may want to work with or work in if they're not happy with their own local government, that you would go, yeah, we've found these local governments really are leading the way and are proud to be doing so compared to others. City of Stirling, we found a decade ago really hard to deal with, but again, culturally things have changed there. Culture is bred from the top, as you said, and we've got a great CEO like Stev Roddick and planning director like Amanda Shears. That culture breeds down through the team to say, hey, we're a council that we want developers to come to. We want them to invest into our council. And you can see they're now one of the most facilitative councils in Western Australia, and also being the biggest makes a big difference to Perth as well when developers are looking to aspire in that area.
Yeah, people make a huge difference. I would say, and there's plenty of great people in all organisations, people do the best sometimes in the system they have, and ultimately we do need to accept that we do live in a democracy, and elected members rightly are supposed to represent the interests of ratepayers and residents and should act accordingly. And I do believe that, of course, professionals have a role to play in providing sound advice and judgment and decisions where they've got the power to do. But ultimately, I think you need to roll with democracy whether you like the results or not. I'd add to that, though, is that I don't necessarily think that the broader setup of local governments across the metropolitan area is optimised for success. And
That's a big point. That's a
super
structural
touchy
issue.
It is a structural issue, and we know there's very low turnout with voting and the like. A lot of the boundaries are all a little bit randomised and related to old road boards and historical amalgamations and natural geography, which may not necessarily align to key centres and transport nodes and things like that. And my view is that a lot of the planning reform that's taken place over the last couple of years, a lot of it seems to be about doing whatever you possibly can without actually addressing structural local government issues.
Yeah.
And I want to be really clear, that's definitely not an attack on local governments themselves or the people within them, of which I work with plenty, and which all do come to work every day to do good things. But when power gets diffused within systems, just because someone wants to do things a certain way, they can't just overtake the organisation, to be a bit extreme.
Especially in a public system as well.
Yeah. And it's not just a matter of culture, it's about resources and expertise and systems and software and all those sorts of things. And I do wonder if we had a bit more of a rational local government organisation across the metropolitan area, where they were probably around more probably aligned to the mid-size. And I think most people in industry would say that generally those local governments that are more in the middle, upper end of the middle rung in terms of scale, tend to operate better. They get to a certain scale, sometimes it feels like you're dealing with a state government department, lose that local touch. And too small, you've got a much smaller pool of expertise and resources and systems and things like that. I think that is something that we as a city need to deal with at a certain point in time.
I don't know that we have the bravery though, Sean. Like, it was brought up, 10 years ago?
Like 2014, 2015 or so.
There you go. And I don't think many people were actually against it other than the local government organisations themselves. From a public perspective, I think other than the western suburbs, who would have lost a bit of representation in their massively overrepresented situation they have right now, most other people thought, that's sufficient. We're spending less on red tape and bureaucracy, and we really don't need all those councils as well. If they're all the size of the city of Melville, for example, I would have thought you have quite a much more efficient outcome a lot of the way.
Yeah, potentially. And the end goal must always be in pursuit of the best service possible for the lowest cost for taxpayers. To rationally assess a system or an entity or organisation is never necessarily an attack on the people within it. Government departments get spliced and diced and moved around every couple of years. There's no reason that any other level of government should be considered as a sacred cow that can never be touched.
In the meantime, what it does, that stagnation, is it creates stagnation in certain pockets of property in Perth when it comes to the planning perspective especially, and that cyclical nature of culture, as you've spoken to, will facilitate development, whether it's infill or urban expansion in the city of Vincent or the city of Swan in certain years, and then absolutely grind to a halt in other years based on really the behest of the council at the time and whether they're infiltrated by certain single action views or not. And that can be at odds with the broader state requirements over the medium to long term to achieve housing outcomes that the state isn't even in control of the need for when it comes to top line immigration, which is a federal thing. And that's where I think the real issue aligns, is that you've got the federal government creating the need case when they decide how many people rock up in the country, the state government then trying to facilitate housing being created with its various policies, but the local governments invariably being the ones that are able to pull the handbrake if they feel like it at the time. And so all the time here we've got this disconnect between the influences and the controls within our system, and it's the private players that get paid a lot of money a lot of the time to try and navigate what is a far harder system than it should need to be to achieve the basic need of housing people.
Yeah, and look, like I was saying before, in relation to the product of reform, a lot of the decisions and certainly all the controls, or the vast majority of controls which local governments have in place, filter through the state. The state plays the outsized role in this whole process, for sure.
Let's look specifically, if we can, in the second part of this conversation at the City of Perth as a bit of a thought leader and cultural leader when it comes to facilitating infill. There are a number of apartment projects going on in the city right now. There are a number of apartment-sized student accommodation projects undertaken. We've got the university. We've got conversations around what may or may not happen in the convention centre refurbishment. There's a lot going on in the city right now and a lot more planned. Can you give us a bit of an overview from the sectors of retail, commercial, education, build to rent, short stay, and just our general civic centres as to how we are progressing in the city, given a lot of people just don't go to the city anymore, whether it's inconvenient, they don't need to, they don't feel safe, or they don't have any friends that live there anymore. They don't work there. There's a lot of people, I think, who haven't been back for a long time.
Sure. Yeah, let's do a sector-by-sector rundown in terms of what's happening in the core and surrounds. And then I wouldn't mind also talking about some of the planning changes which are happening to the city as well, which are fairly significant.
Maybe we should start with them and then go from there.
And I'd also say I'm a city person. I live in the CBD. I have for quite some time. I love being in the city. I love urbanity. And I love it from a personal perspective, but also think, again, back to culture, cities at a metropolitan scale, but also quite rightly at your core, they're a physical manifestation and reflection of your values and your aspirations, which is why, quite appropriately, it gets a lot more attention than other parts of the city. And it's your first impression to your visitors. It's your shining light to the rest of the metropolitan area and the state in terms of who we are, which is why it's important that we invest and that we plan for it accordingly. So in relation to some of the planning changes coming through, so the City of Perth's planning scheme was, I think, originally implemented in 2002 or so and underwent a fairly significant review I think in 14, which upped the plot ratio amounts by a fair amount, and I think from memory also broadened the bonus categories too.
So essentially allowing more height and density on the same block.
Yeah, pretty much. And there was also a fairly large liberalisation of built form controls across the city too, particularly in areas like Stirling Street, where we've seen a lot of the towers pop up. So that is a downstream impact of those changes, which take quite some time, of course, to be physically present. There's been a fair amount of time since that last major review, and for those that have a broader national perspective, the allowable development intensity within the CBD and surrounds in the City of Perth is in many cases magnitudes less than other capital cities across Australia. Personally, I'm not entirely hot on the idea of plot ratio as a concept itself.
I don't think you find many people who are, to be honest.
Yeah, and for those not familiar with that, it's effectively an extrapolation of your site area. So let's say if you've got a site area of 1,000 square metres, if your plot ratio is 5:1, you get 5,000 square metres of effectively built form capacity on that piece of land. There's all sorts of nuances to do with that, but that's the general concept. And then in addition to that, you have controls around the size of your podium and your setbacks and the height of your towers and things like that in most circumstances. And then you also have parking standards and internal amenity standards, and you really have to ask yourself, if the CBD is the one place in the metropolitan area where towers are the norm and expected, and also the minimum standard to a certain degree, and particularly the sort of minimum thing you need to do to make anything stack up given the cost of land in the city, what are you trying to achieve by controlling floor space? I don't think that question's been answered. These things just happen. Most cities across the world probably, or certainly in an Australian context, use plot ratio quite a lot, particularly for urban scale development, because it's just something that's been done.
Yeah, because we always have.
Keep doing
we
it.
just tinker with the ratio rather than reviewing whether we need it at all.
Yeah, exactly. And look, some people like it. Some developers like it because it's quite clear in terms of what's possible from a value perspective, and also helps contain the market to a certain degree. I don't think that's the intent of policymakers now, that it's some sort of market controlling force. It's like a built form intensity controlling force, which to a certain degree concentrates activity around train stations and CBDs, but that just happens organically and naturally via the market, because of course people want to be closer to train stations or in certain areas of high amenity. So it's difficult to judge if it's enabling that or just accommodating what would already occur within a market.
And what are we protecting from as well? A lot of controls really are to protect neighbours who seek varying levels of privacy or varying levels of access or amenity. And if everyone's in the same situation of high-rise density and we're all living on top of each other and next to each other, I would assume that we're all signing up to that lower level of privacy and a higher level of access and amenity. And therefore, the mix needs to change in terms of what's actually important. We probably need to control things in Duncraig in a very different way than we need to control things in the city.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would suggest there nearly needs to be minimum heights, minimum plot ratios rather than maximums in areas where you've often only got one chance to have something built for the next 100, 200 years. And it's often that we undervalue the opportunity cost of the use of that square metre of land in the city for future generations, which I think is far more important than whether there was an extra 2 or 3 levels in 2025 on a property.
Yeah, I agree. In saying that, I'm always cautious about sticks. If you've got minimum heights or whatever, it doesn't magically mean that scale of development is viable or appealing to whoever owns that piece of land. And I say this as well when I read sometimes people say, oh, if you time limit the approval, that will force developers to build something. So if you give a developer 2 years or 1 year to build something, it doesn't mean magically they have $150 million in the bank to build a luxury apartment tower. The market will work itself out. Planning doesn't need to dabble too much in those areas, I think. But back to what we were originally talking about in terms of those changes to the city scheme, and to be clear, they're certainly not in force or anything like that yet. But for geeks which trawl through agendas and the like, the documents are available in terms of what the city is proposing. My understanding is that it hasn't been formally advertised yet, so it doesn't necessarily have any status, but let's assume this will be in place by middle or end of next year, probably slightly optimistically. So the general point is that base plot ratios are increasing quite a bit, and the maximum bonuses available as just a general number are also increasing a fair bit. And also the avenues through which you can achieve bonuses are also broadening a fair bit.
So what's an example?
Sure. So just picking a few random sites across the city. To give a bit more of a significant example, looking at some of the key lots in City West, where SciTech is at the moment.
A 3 or 4 story building there right now?
Barely, and surrounded by surface car parking. So the actual plot ratio on site would be probably less than 1, if I were to guess. So the current base allowance on City West is 2 to 1, and then it's proposed it'll go up to 5.5 to 1. So what's that, almost triple?
So what would that look like if we could plonk a different building that already exists on City West? What would that framework allow?
Not that I've done the math on that particular site, but I would imagine on that site you can get quite a few large towers on top of a large retail or office complex or something like that.
The sort of buildings you see right now next to the RAC Arena?
Yeah, probably even higher, to be honest.
Wow. So that really changes the amenity of that location, the value of that land as well for that landowner, as well as the way we interact with that part of the city, in the same way that right now we're seeing the old City Holden Motors site being redeveloped right now, and we can see apartment towers that are going to go up there. That changes the way we interact with that whole region. There's an Aldi coming in. It really starts to justify some key tenancies and service amenities for people to be able to live there. And we wouldn't have even imagined that in City West previously.
Yeah, absolutely. And just because the framework changes doesn't mean it will happen or happen anytime soon, but there's literally zero negative impacts of allowing the possibility to occur. So I think that's a great thing. And that's replicated across the whole City of Perth area, essentially, in terms of those uplifts to varying degrees.
So for the really lay listener right now, the City of Perth has proposed a much higher density and height limitation on a lot of the land in the city, which doesn't mean it will happen overnight. It doesn't mean that it will stack up financially, but at some point in time we very well may see the city start to look taller and broader in its size based on the zoning framework, the changes to the zoning framework that none of us on a lay side would recognise on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's right. And these things have consequences, and we all know there's high-level targets for quite substantive increases in the residential population of the City of Perth. And it's also a fact that the density within central Perth is significantly lower than comparable Australian cities.
Be viewed as a bit unsafe, a bit dead, retail struggling, office struggling. Is that what's given that view? Is just there's not enough people? I remember having Basil Zemplis sitting where you're sitting, and his answer was, we just need more people in the city. Is this an outcome of those views?
Is one major component that will make the city a better place. We want people to want to be there and to create new businesses and to live there. I think there's a lot of structural issues with the city that are spatial and infrastructure related, which partly contribute to the issues that you mentioned. Perth Water, the big chunk of Swan River at the southern part of the CBD, is beautiful, of course, and a large part of the amenity that the city offers in terms of views and just proximity to water. But it also means that the city's cut off from the south. And if you think about some of the greatest cities in the world, Paris, Madrid, a lot of the Asian metropolises, they're just this hub of activity in a sea of vanity in all directions. So you think about Perth, it's cut off from the south with the river, it's cut off from the west with Kings Park, and then the north, it drops off like a cliff.
It does. Brisbane
like
Street's 3
towers,
stories.
And then a kilometre out, you're back to single houses and old cottages. It's pretty extreme. And then also to the east, it's partly cut off by the river. And we don't have that many river crossings as well. Brisbane has a river, a much smaller river.
Much
but they have a lot
narrower
more
river.
They have a lot more crossings as well. Cities will always be a product of not just the people within them, but the number of people that can access that place in a shorter time as possible. So if you think about all the places that the city is effectively cut off, that structurally inhibits its growth.
Transport amenity as well. Getting in and out, it's a lot harder to do that.
And the train stations within the central city are quite limited in terms of where they are. They're all bunched up in a certain area. They don't really go through the guts of West Perth at all. And there's effectively really no train stations in the eastern part of the city as well. Not that there's anything on the agenda or anything like that, but I would love to see, and whenever the next wave of rail building occurs in this city, I'd like to see more underground lines going through the city, which spread around the stations within the city, which will enable the city to grow a lot more off its fairly narrow strips of activity on an east-west basis and increasingly on a north-south basis.
That is one
William
of the
Street.
key fundamentals of the major cities in the world, is that they have a metro underground that seems to have a station every 500 metres and connects everyone, obviously protecting against weather that we don't often have to protect against, but it helps people just get around a lot more efficiently, and we obviously don't have that. We have people required to walk a good kilometre or two, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in the 40 degrees heat or in the rain limits people's preference to want to have to do that, and therefore we live in the suburbs and drive cars out of our garages and go on park.
Absolutely, which is why changes to frameworks are good, but the scale of development already allowable within the City of Perth is already significant. Vast parts of the city already have no height limit. So there's certainly no lack of development sites in the city within the system as it is at the moment. And you're quite right. Imagine if you lived in West Perth near Thomas Street and you wanted to pop into the city for groceries on Sunday night. Firstly, it's illegal to go grocery shopping on Sunday night for some bizarre reason. Two, I don't think the cat buses even run then, and it's a bus, so it doesn't really have that permanency that people crave. There's no quick way to pop in, so the CBD has been atomised across these very distinct parts where it's quite difficult to move between them. And even where proximity and distance isn't necessarily an issue, the amenity is an issue. Let's say you lived in West Perth, only a few blocks west of the freeway. I'm not sure if you ever tried to walk under or over that freeway. It's pretty unpleasant.
Yeah.
Like, it's quite clear who and what mode of transport is prioritised there. There's no trees, there's no shelter, the lighting may work, and it's just unpleasant, it's noisy. The streets aren't built in a way that you would expect in a city, urban environment that's friendly to pedestrians. And the same applies to the non-central train stations. So you think about the state of City West train station, you think about Mackayber and Claysbrook station.
They're being spoken about being amalgamated and shut down.
Yeah, potentially. That rumour comes up every couple of years, but I've never seen any concrete plans. The quality of stations along the new Armidale line and new outer rail extensions are of much greater quality. And in some of those places, I think you still need to cross. There's the broader spatial geographic constraints on the city. There's definitely the transport issue. And then there's also, I don't think there's enough attention paid to the tactile environment and experience of the city.
Let's talk about the experience of the city and people being able to get in and out with reference to the impending opening of the ECU University campus. That brings thousands of people into the city on a daily basis, doesn't it, Sean? Where are they going to sleep? We know there's a few buildings getting built at the moment.
Yeah, ECU is a great project, and absolute credit to the state as well as federal government actually for funding that project. And I always used to say, because everyone's talked about a university in the city for quite some time, you get me, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, and I thought, hold on a second, all these universities, in terms of their suburban campuses, they're all there because they got free land many years ago, sometimes at the beginning of the last century. Of course, it's going to take free land, essentially, and probably more for a university in the city to come to be. So I'm glad that point was realised by the powers that be. And that's thousands of students, thousands of staff,
thousands of coffees being bought, thousands of beers.
It's great. And it's exactly where it should be. And people also forget how many theatres and performance spaces are in that building. It's pretty impressive. They're stacked on each other. It's a really incredibly complex building. And think about the logistics of building theatres, which require silence on top of functioning rail lines. Very impressive and no doubt expensive. So there's going to be just like you said, the impact of those people being the city, going to classes and going to the library and whatnot, but also the increased performance capacity of the city, which is awesome. And in terms of where they'll sleep, I don't know what the domestic international split of ECU is, but I'm assuming that the international split will probably grow given their new location, which is great. And there's thousands of student accommodation beds under construction and many thousands more proposed in the city. And that's a really exciting growth sector where it's very professionally managed asset class, where the right accommodation at the right price is provided to the people that need it in the areas that they want to live as well, which is convenient or close to their point of study. So There's a new building on Wellington Pier Street, Uni Lodge, which is about to open in the next couple of months, I understand. There's another Uni Lodge that's just started construction on Wellington Street. There's a big project at UWA on its Nedlands campus, which is just about to start construction. And there's also a few existing buildings on Stirling Street as well. And like I said, many more to come. That's great. And I can't remember what the latest stats are for the City of Perth in terms of its residential population, but let's assume it's 30,000 at the moment. Some of these buildings have 800 plus beds. So you're talking about like a several % increase in the city's population in a single building.
This starts to have
several of them happening at once.
It starts to have a dent in our deficit on housing, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
When you're able to pull people out of share homes in the suburbs and into the city.
Yeah, and it's fit for purpose as well. You think about if you're a young student coming from Malaysia, excited to visit Perth, and you're stuck in a share house in Uluru and having to catch a bus and a train to the city. It sucks a lot of time out of your day and probably a lot of your spending power as well. Or otherwise, think about if you're living on Wellington Street, 30 stories up in the sky with a great view, and you can walk 10 minutes to campus. I think that's good for everybody. Just sticking with education, look, it's good to see that the primary school will soon start construction in East Perth, and that's good, and that's part of attracting a broader cohort to the city. Retail, I think, has been a bit of a sore spot for the city. The city's gone through a pretty impressive wave of hotel building, new office buildings, residential, a bit patchy. But you think about, and hospitality's done relatively good too, in terms of let's say the proposition of restaurants and entertainment venues for people to come to the city. You look at retail, and I think most people would agree, including the asset owners in the city, it's not difficult to understand why a resident living in Mount Lawley might choose to drive to Karrinyup instead of going to the city to shop. There's more choice, better stores, more flagship stores.
Don't have to pay for parking.
Yeah, and just an all-round better environment. And obviously some people prefer shopping centres, some people prefer a more urban environment. But the actual retail product itself is significantly better. And CBD retail is not dead. Just because people are working from home doesn't mean that CBD retail isn't a thing anymore. Retail is still an incredibly prosperous part of the economy, and people will travel all sorts of distances and go to places where they think they'll have a good experience. And CBD retail is certainly not dead in Sydney. If anything, it's going through a renaissance. And Melbourne is absolutely bursting at the seams as well in terms of retail, because they've got the centres with scale. The retailers on the ground are providing amazing experiences and flagship stores, and that's what's missing in Perth, is that those centres where it's like professionally managed, where you've got several dozen or several hundred stores all in one place, and ideally you have multiple centres as well. And I think quite instrumental to that will be Carillion if that gets off the ground, and a TBC if that will occur.
Less likely or more likely that will occur this decade?
I really don't know, to be honest. The development's approved, I understand. It's got several, I think 3 or 4 levels of retail with student accommodation and a hotel on top. And it's right in the centre of the ant trail of the city. And hopefully that will be the beginning of turning around the ship of retail in the city. In saying that, look, there's still activity. There's a new Apple store. Certain stores are expanding and moving to larger premises. Luxury retail is quite strong in the city at the moment, which is quite interesting. That's a bit of a lag flow on from the frothy consumer spending which occurred post-COVID. I'm curious to see if that will be maintained, and there were some good stats in the Fin Review the last week or two showing that revenue's starting to dip across a lot of these major luxury retailer houses. So it'll be interesting to see if that will be sustained, but nevertheless it's always good to see new stores opening in the city.
Okay, so we've done planning, we've done education, student accommodation, retail. I think we need to finish off with hotels and those larger commercial buildings.
Sure. So hotels, like I mentioned, we went through a bit of a building boom with hotels in the 2010s with a huge number of new keys to market, and finally some good quality 5-star hotels in the city centre, which was sorely needed.
Like Westin,
Ritz-Carlton, heaps of new hotels, and putting a bit more pressure on the market, because I think the market got a bit lazy there for quite some time. What we're seeing at the moment is actually going backwards. So there's actually hotels that are closing. So the Hyatt closed and it's become the short stay residential thing, which is a little bit interesting. Fraser's closing because the state government purchased that, of course. And the Rendezvous in the west end of the CBD is being converted to student housing at the moment. I think is opening imminently as well.
But we know that we have a really high occupancy rate and they're charging a fortune per room per night. Why would they be closing? Is it just because they can make even more money off students in short stay and they've got the building so they may as well be nimble?
Yeah, I think that's the base calculation, essentially, that they can make more money doing a different use. And that also plays out in terms of developments that never started as well. So there's plenty of approvals throughout the entire city for hotels that never occurred. And to give an example, that Uni Lodge student accommodation development on Wellington Street that I mentioned earlier, further west.
The old Army surplus area.
No, this one's further down on Wellington Street, the one that's just started, not the one on Pier Street. That was originally approved for a hotel. So people are making the calculation before the development's even gone off the ground that they'd be better off doing student accommodation, which is interesting. There are some new hotels coming on stream shortly with the Dorset and the Perth City Link, as well as EQ West at Vicar Go's development at Elizabeth Quay. TBC, what the operator of that will be. The intent was for an independent operator, but that might be subject to change. One interesting thing from those planning changes that we also discussed is that some of the hotels which came to fruition during that building boom are partly a result of bonuses which were provided for hotels under the City of Perth's planning framework. But under the changes as currently proposed, those bonuses for hotels will actually go away, so it won't be an incentivised land use. In saying that, there's still plenty of plot ratio to go around, but they actually won't be incentivised. So it'll be interesting to see what impact that has on future supply.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic when we think about demand and supply, but then probably a good thing, something that we should aspire to be, is to be nimble as an organisation when trying to adapt to a changing market.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, with commercial, look, there's been a little bit of activity. 9th Esplanade's recently opened, a few small scale developments around town in the years preceding that, Capital Square and the like. But at the moment, there's actually no major commercial building under construction in the city, which is probably the first time in a decent period of time. That probably reflects the same cost pressures that all sectors are experiencing, which is understandable, but also reflecting the fact that the vacancy rate's still around, I think, 16 or 17%, which is still relatively historically high. So
we're seeing a lot of refurbs though, aren't we?
Heaps of refurbs, all the lobby upgrades and building amenity upgrades as you normally would through the course of time, and there's still people moving between buildings, and the whole flight to quality thing's still definitely true. But yeah, in terms of major new supply, certainly nothing in the pipeline. Plenty of proposals out there, of course, that haven't been built. So the market's ready to respond when big tenants come up for grabs, but no major projects under construction at the moment. There are some interesting proposals. There's a fairly large tower proposed in Northridge at the moment for a state government agency. And it was also interesting to see that the PTA actually bought the old Sunday Times site in Perth/Northbridge a few weeks or months ago. Interesting to see what the plans is for that site, whether it's part of some broader state government plan or whether it's something specifically related to the PTA.
Hopefully it means construction at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And just rounding off with resi, I know we talked about student accommodation. As we talked on last time, I was on this podcast, for a housing crisis, there's not that many cranes in the sky. I think there's more cranes in the sky since we had that chat. But at least so far in the City of Perth, there's still very limited projects under construction. There's Finbar's project in East Perth. There's a few smaller luxury type developments that have recently finished in West Perth, but really nothing of substantive scale. In a crisis like this, it'd be great if we were seeing 300-metre towers with 500 units in them, but it's simply not happening, and that's absolutely a result of cost pressures.
That's the thing with the demand-supply situation. What you would expect to see in places like Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane is 5 or 6 massive towers that eventually end up in oversupply and a developer who goes bust because they can't finish selling out the last apartment building. We're in the opposite situation where no one's pulling the trigger.
Yeah, and look, I do sympathise with developers in the Perth market. I'm sure they've all been burnt throughout their entire careers. Perth does have this annoying habit to go up and down a fair bit. But like you said, given the scale of immigration and just overall city population growth, there's definitely need for more apartments. And also picking up on one of the first points we discussed around market failure, some of the largest points of activity are actually state government investment in housing in the City of Perth at the moment. So there's a major project on Pier Street. Common Ground, I think, is almost finished. And there's also a new project on Rose Street, which will presumably kick off shortly. Investment is occurring, but it's not necessarily occurring at the scale that's required, nor providing actual market product to meet market demand, unfortunately. And honestly, I don't know how that's going to turn around.
Yeah, it seems like the only projects in that medium price space that will get off the ground will be ones that are sponsored by the taxpayer. But the taxpayer only has so much money and capabilities to be able to build the requirements at scale. So I think we go back to the same conversation I was having with David Crest probably 2 or so years ago in this studio, and that is until house prices rise high enough for people to spend enough money on an apartment off the plan, we just won't see those apartments getting financed and then getting built over the next 2.5 years, which is how you get to assumptions and positions that the HIA have in we won't fix this decade. You add all those numbers together, you're pretty easily past 2030.
Yeah, and I have to say, unfortunately, that's slightly depressing because the government can do things at scale compared to a standalone private developer, but it's still not nearly the scale required to meet the population growth that we're experiencing. So the state government's building, 1,000 or 2 units in the context of 60 to 70,000 annual population growth.
It's not hitting the sides, Sean.
It's not hitting the sides, and saying that there's still plenty of houses being built, particularly on the fringes. But also, what was the other point I was going to make? Oh, sorry. And I'll also add that it's also a little bit sad that we're in the situation where we've got a housing crisis, so there's clearly a need for demand. Prices are already high, and then apparently the only solution is that prices must be even higher.
Yeah.
You just do the math of people on even moderate professional incomes, the math doesn't work. That is a solution to one part of the problem, but it creates a whole series of cascading problems. And I think that is something which is affecting the overall productivity of the nation, of the sheer quantum of dollars and proportions of incomes that are going to housing or housing investment, which I think is affecting people's quality of life, but also the appropriate channeling of capital into productive parts of the economy which create prosperity.
So young people are putting money into getting their first home that they otherwise would have been putting into starting a small business.
Absolutely. Or investing in something else. And it's just manipulating the entire economic system.
At the moment, this seems to be the game, and I don't know how the game changes unless we have a structural, ideological change on the way that everyone is impacted financially in this country. The only thing I see as being the way this is fixed is if immigration gets capped to probably 40% of what it has been over the last few years. I don't see that happening under the current regime, and so I don't see the outcomes changing either over the next few years.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And look, putting aside even if you were to contemplate changes to that setting, you would normally expect that the market would calibrate itself. So if someone wants to move here and they see the cost of a house, they'd be less inclined to do, but those stabilizers aren't naturally kicking in. It's a really interesting situation.
I think because the choice they've got around the rest of the Western world has pretty similar outcomes. You look at places like Canada, you look at places like England, they have the same problems as us. And so if you're thinking about these substitutable locations for people from the Eastern world who are the major immigration sources right now for places like Perth, they've got lesser of two evils really that they're choosing from here, and that's what Perth is. It's twice the price it was 5 years ago, but it's still half the price of Sydney.
Comparatively cheap.
And that's where we sit right now. And I think to continually have these conversations, to shine a light on what it will take for it to change, and continually shine a light on where we are along that journey, will then give our listeners that, hopefully, that leg up in understanding their own position with regards to their relationship with property in Perth every time we have that chat. Sean, thanks so much for coming in, mate. It's always enlightening understanding your views about the structure of the property market and also the more specific explanations and updates on where the City of Perth, the leaders of our culture really when it comes to property, sitting from their perspective as well. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Trent.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!